All right, we're going to go ahead and get started here. I see there's only one participant right now in the interactive portion of this, but we may have some others in webinar world. Welcome to everyone. If you're watching this recorded, welcome to you as well. Today we're going to be talking about theology in our foundational documents. We'll talk about it in terms of our articles of incorporation. We'll talk about it in terms of our bylaws. We're going to talk about the necessity of having some liability and risk management measures in place in terms of our hamartiology, or our understanding, our theology of sin, and the ethics that should be produced as a result of that study. And then finally, we're going to talk a little bit about risk management in our missiology, and how we can, as pastors and as church leaders, can shepherd people to understand that risk management and or that taking risk is part and parcel of following Christ, and we can do that while at the same time protecting the church from one of the riskiest things that churches do. So I'm going to give some people just a little bit longer to get plugged in here. We still had several signed up that are. It doesn't look like they're in the room yet, but they may be in webinar world. So we're just going to give them a couple more minutes. But let me tell you a little bit about myself first. Again, my name is Josh Bryant. I'm the managing attorney of Church General Counsel. And we do two things. We first of all balance and help churches balance church growth and ministry needs, but we do that in a manner that facilitates legal compliance and risk management best practices. And so we're here to answer questions and do all the traditional lawyer stuff. We want to give advice. We want to help you draft documents or review any documents that you need to have drafted. We are certainly here to answer any questions you've got, but at the same time, we also want to take a very proactive approach in helping you and your church have a policy manual, have articles of incorporation, have bylaws, and things like that are designed to not only facilitate church growth, to facilitate ministry needs, and church purity is one of the things we're going to talk about today, but also we want to make sure that facilitates good legal best practices in terms of your risk management and your legal compliance with all the different regulations that churches could find themselves subject to. So with that, let me say that we do that at a low annual rate. It's as low as $1,000 a year, depending on the size of your church. And there's no additional fees on top of that. There may be some costs incurred for printing or travel or something like that. But as far as the attorney fee is concerned, it can be as low as $1,000 a year, and that's done. So let's go ahead and get started. We're going to spend a lot of time. I know this was not in the agenda, but we're going to start talking, and we're going to spend a lot of time talking about statements of faith and why churches need statements of faith. And here's the deal. We're going to do that because that statement of faith is going to be kind of the foundation. It's going to be the launching point, for lack of a better term, into what theological doctrines and principles that we're going to put in your articles of incorporation and your bylaws. So if it's going to be a statement of faith, we kind of need to have a working definition of faith. And I'm talking to theologians and seminarians and pastors. And look, you guys know what faith is, but I'm going to read just real briefly James chapter 2, verses 22 through 24, and then verse 26, because we see a good, not a definition necessarily, but we kind of see faith and how it manifests itself and how it plays itself out in the real world. And so here's what it says. It says, you see that faith was working with his works. And he's talking about Abraham. And how he was ready to sacrifice Isaac on the altar. And James says, you see that faith was working with his works, and as a result of the works, faith was perfected. Excuse me, just 1 second. Well, I apologize. We're going to have to wait until that stops ringing. I should have turned that off before we got going. But anyways, it says, and Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness, and he was called the friend of God. You see that a man is justified by his works and not by faith alone. For just as the body without the spirit is dead, so also faith without works is dead. That's James 2, 22 through 24 and verse 26. So what we see here, that is faith being defined as belief in action. It's not just your beliefs and what you think and what you understand, and it's also being able to act on those beliefs. And so as such, we need to make sure that we have a statement of faith that is not just a list of here's what we believe, but it's also here's what we believe and here's how we're going to act on that, okay? So all that stuff said, every church needs a publicly declared statement of faith, okay? That may be up to your church as a congregation. It may be up to the senior pastor or the staff. It may be up to the board of elders or the bishop or some other adjudicatory authority. But any church or any diocese, really any ministry, needs a publicly declared statement of faith. These are our beliefs, and here's how we're going to act on them. You need a statement to that effect. Now, what should be in your statement of faith? Well, I would say this: everything that you would expect a staff member, a leader, or a member to believe, that needs to be in your statement of faith. It's going to include your bibliology. What do you believe about Scripture in the Bible? It's going to include your theology proper. What do you believe about God, the Father? It's going to include anthropology. What do you believe about man? And hamartiology. What do you believe about sin? It's going to talk about what you believe about Christ, your Christology, your pneumatology. What do you believe about the Spirit? Your soteriology. What do you believe about salvation? Your ecclesiology. What do you believe about the church? Your eschatology. What do you believe about the end times? And then finally, your ethics. What are you going to do? How are you going to act on all of those different things? And so those need to be in your statement of faith. In short, everything that you learned in your first semester of systematic theology in seminary, that needs to be in your statement of faith. Now, I would say this: you need to have everything that, like I said, a staff member, a leader, or a member should believe. And that's really up to, again, your church, your board of elders, your adjudicatory authority, whatever. But in my opinion, it needs to be only that which is foundation to the gospel, okay? And really, out of all of those things that I just mentioned, the only thing that I might pull out is eschatology, because that's inherently, just by definition, no one knows when Christ is going to return. And so there's a lot of differing opinions on eschatology. And so that one you may not necessarily need to have in your statement of faith. I think it's good to have it there. So why? Why do you need to have all this stuff in a statement of faith? Well, the purity of your church can act as an outstanding defense against any attacks that would come from a legal standpoint. And what do I mean by that? Well, look, we complain a lot of time, okay? And I remember going back, goodness, as far as me being in a youth group 20, 25 years ago, we complain a lot about the church looking an awful lot like the world. And we don't want the church to look like the world. We want a pure church, and a pure church is not going to look a lot like the world. And there's going to come a time that churches that look like the world are going to be treated like the world. And so that's one of the reasons I say that the purity of the church can be a great defense mechanism, because at the end of the day, we don't want the church to be treated like the world, because as we'll see here in just a second, there are a lot of bad things that can happen. For instance, charitable deductions to churches. These deductions are already under attack, and they can be increasingly scrutinized. The church's tax-free status may change and may even disintegrate. And it's already happening to a certain degree. As tithing goes down, churches are inherently looking for other means of generating income for the church, and the IRS is watching. We have a pretty favorable administration right now, but that's not always going to be the case. We certainly can't assume that that's always going to be the case. And so we need to make sure we're paying attention. These coffee shops, these bookstores, these childcare facilities, schools, and so forth and so on that are going into church, I've got no problem with those, and there are ways that we can make those legally work. But all of those are being watched to see if they look primarily like a business more than like a nonprofit entity. And so the IRS is watching those things. Property tax exemptions. A lot of church property is exempt from taxation. Those could start to go away if we're going to be treated like the world. Charitable immunity as a doctrine is already all but gone. That is a doctrine that says you can't sue a charity, basically. That's already basically gone. There are only a few states. Matter of fact, Arkansas may be the only state that still recognizes it to a degree. There may be some states where it's still in place in at least portions, but at the end of the day, charitable immunity is all but gone. The clergy housing allowance, we've already seen that come under attack, and there has been an injunction issued in the state of Wisconsin out of a federal court there. That will go up on appeal. I think we have to assume that the church is going to lose on that fight if we're taking the stance that clergy should have tax-free housing. And so that's seems like it's going to be on its way out. The tax filings of the church. Right now, you don't really even have to file a 990. You're exempt from that as a church. And a 990 is the tax return that a nonprofit has to file. churches still have some reporting requirements, but at the end of the day, what we're going to see, if we're not careful, if we're going to be treated like the world, not only are we going to have to see those 990s, but there's going to be additional tax filings that we're going to have, or even worse, we're going to have to start filing for-profit tax filings. We don't want to do that at all. Religious exemptions could start to go away if the church is going to be treated like the world. For example, the anti-discrimination laws, they're called SOGI, or sexual orientation and gender identity laws. We'll get into some of those, but that's one aspect of an anti-discrimination law where churches right now are exempt. And we're going to talk more about those here in just a few minutes in quite a bit more detail. But at the end of the day, if those religious exemptions go away, now churches are going to be subject to those laws. And if a church is subject to a SOGI law, that means a whole lot. And we'll, again, talk about that in a minute. But anti-discrimination in terms of the hiring of females as pastors. There are some churches who follow a complementarian view in their theology and would say that God has reserved the role and the office of pastor in the church for men. Other churches disagree, and that's fine. But at the end of the day, that could open yourself up to a sex or a gender discrimination suit if the church is going to be treated like the world. Unemployment insurance. We could start to see churches be required to carry federal and state unemployment insurance and pay unemployment benefits. And that is a cost to the church. The church right now is just not prepared to handle. And there are several others, court involvement in churches. Right now, there's a doctrine called the ecclesiastical abstention doctrine. And basically what that means is that the courts are going to stay out of the inner workings of the church. But we're already starting to see that doctrine be very slowly whittled away at, where churches or courts are starting to get more and more involved in the inner workings of churches. And we don't want to see those exemptions go away. We don't want the church to be treated like the world is treated. Secondly, a pure church is going to require discipline. And sometimes that means we need to deny or we need to revoke membership because people don't believe or act in conformity with the church. And there are some specific problems that are associated with not being able to exercise church discipline. And again, we'll talk about those a little bit more in a minute, but specifically defamation can become more of an issue because if you don't have that doctrinal and ethical framework to fall back on, the argument is that you're just spouting an opinion, not spouting a fact in the course of any church discipline that you might engage in. And so we've got to be very careful there. And ultimately, here's what we can fall back on. Here's the promise from Scripture that we can rely on. Jesus said that he was going to build his church and that the gates of hell wouldn't prevail against it. And if we're going to claim that promise, we need to make sure that what we're building, what we're shepherding, what we're overseeing, what we're pastoring, all those things need to be exactly what Jesus was referring to when he said he would build his church. And so we need to make sure that what we have aligns with what Jesus said he was going to protect and what was going to be victorious. And so to that extent, we need to make sure we have a pure church. All right. So all that said, let's talk about theology proper in foundational documents. Number one, bylaws. Bylaws are a foundational document of every church. You need to have bylaws, and it's really any organization. You need to have bylaws in an LLC or a corporation. You need them in any nonprofit organization. You certainly need them in a church. So what are bylaws? Well, bylaws it's like a constitution. A bylaw or a document that is called the bylaws. Those are principles on which your church is governed. And so you need to have these bylaws and your statement of faith, the entire thing that we just talked about, your bibliology, your anthropology, your theology proper, your hamartiology, all of those things, they need to be in your bylaws, okay? It needs to be a statement in your bylaws that says this is what we believe. And listen, if faith incorporates both belief and action on that belief, then the document that governs the actions of the church needs to have a statement of faith, a statement of belief in it. And so you need to have that statement of faith in your bylaws, and that's certainly something that we can help you with at Church General Council. And then your articles of incorporation. What are these? Your articles are documents that you file with the state that tell the state that the organization that you are pastoring or that you are organizing or you're putting together, that organization actually exists. Okay, and then it provides some very basic definition around the organization itself, okay? And so you need to have at least some basic theology in your articles of incorporation. And here's what I recommend. First of all, I recommend that your bibliology is in your articles of incorporation, okay? This is just a statement that basically says the Bible is our foundational document, not our bylaws, not our articles of incorporation. We rest on Scripture. And so you need to have your bibliology and your understanding of specifically its authority and its inerrancy. That needs to be in your articles of incorporation. Your ecclesiology, a statement that says this is what we believe about the organization that we're asking the state to recognize that we're forming and incorporating in this state. We need to be able to define what that is. And so you need to talk about your ecclesiology in your articles of incorporation. You need to talk about your soteriology and your hamartiology. You need to talk about what you believe about salvation and what you believe about sin. And as a result of that, it should come down to some basic ethical principles that you can put in your articles of incorporation. And I limit those ethics. You could write book after book after book on ethical issues as far as Christian ethics are concerned. And when I say ethics here, I'm not talking about bioethics or these big hot topic issues, although those do come into play. What I'm talking about here are your day-to-day operations of the church. And so you need to have some ethics built around that, and you need to put those in your articles of incorporation. And those ethics come from what you believe, your statement of faith, your theology, your hamartiology, all those things. All right. So here's how this works. I would say in your articles of incorporation, you need to have 6 different statements of ethics. First of all, is your basic ethics. This is generally what we expect of church members. This is generally what we expect to do. And that's going to vary widely from church to church, depending on what your specific tradition is, what your specific theology is. But you need to be able to state, this is what we expect of church members. Okay. If we expect them to come to church and gather together, fine. If we expect them to share the gospel, so forth and so on, we need to put that in there. But we're going to go specifically into those other things as well. So for example, you need to have an ethics of evangelism, discipleship, and missions in your articles of incorporation. You need to be able to tell the state and to tell the world that this is what we believe about what the church has been formed to do. That's in your ecclesiology, okay? And based on the fact that we believe, for example, that the church exists to fulfill the Great Commission, for example, go and make disciples of all the nations. If you're going to say this is what we believe, then you need to have an ethical statement that says, listen, we're going to go and make disciples of all the nations, which means we're going to be sharing the gospel. We're going to be doing evangelism in our community. We're going to be doing evangelism in our state. We're going to do evangelism in our nation, and we're going to go throughout the world, the Acts 1:8 principle. And so you need to have a statement of that effect in your articles of incorporation. What else the church can be doing in that regard is discipleship. You're going to be meeting in small groups in Sunday school or life groups or cell groups, small groups, whatever. You're going to be meeting, doing life-on-life discipleship, making people followers of Christ and making them more like Christ and helping each other in that process. You need to talk about your missions and your missiology, that the church exists to make disciples of all the nations. And so talk about how you're going to be sending people abroad, things like that. You need to talk about your ethics of worship and preaching, that because of what we believe about the church, we are going to have music. We're going to sing, and we believe that this is a biblical thing to do. We're going to preach the gospel on a weekly basis. We're going to preach the word of God. These are biblical things to do. So those ethics, those things that you're going to do as a result of your ecclesiology need to be in your articles of incorporation. The ordinance and sacraments, this is exceptionally important that you have this in your articles of incorporation, something that tells the state, here's how we're going to deal with the issues of baptism and the Lord's Supper, and in some traditions, marriage or other sacramental type things, depending on what tradition you come from. So you need to be able to tell the state and the world what you believe about those things and what you're going to do about them. And we'll talk about that more here in just a minute as well. In today's environment, unfortunately, you've got to have an ethical statement about marriage, sexuality, and gender, okay? You need to say we will or we will not perform or recognize same-sex marriages or gender transitions or anything like that. That's just the world we live in now in churches, because that is so ingrained in religious practice, but in the Bible, when we talk about family and marriage, it's there. It is a huge component of what's in the Bible. And so because this is an affront to what a lot of Christians and Protestants and Catholics even believe on these subjects, they need to be in your articles of incorporation. You've got to have that kind of a statement of ethics. And then finally, I'd say you need to have an ethics of mercy statement, some statement that says, this is how we practice mercy towards sinners. From a legal standpoint, this is going to give you the leeway in church discipline to say, listen, the whole point is to show mercy, is to to regenerate and to bring back into the fold that which was lost or has wandered away. And so you need to have a statement of how you practice that mercy in terms of sin and among members, but you also need to talk about your charity. Because listen, we're going to talk about this in a minute, but one of the things that could go away is the charitable deduction. We've already talked about that a little, but if you're not going to be a charitable organization in terms of how you provide charity to the community, things like that, it could create issues later on down the road. We're not seeing it so much yet, but we're again seeing attack after attack after attack on the charitable deduction itself in terms of churches. And so in order to kind of bolster our claim to that charitable status, we need to have some sort of statement of charity in our articles of incorporation. And when we talk about charitable purpose, the IRS has 3 different paragraphs that it certainly recommends and should be in your articles of incorporation. There should be no variation on that to speak of. And so those will be in there, but we also need to make sure we have a statement that talks about how we deal with benevolence and how we're going to assist and aid and help charitable purposes and charitable causes in our community. So, all right, so we've talked about that. That's the statement of faith and the theology in your foundational documents. Now I want to move on to something that I've entitled The Liability of Hamartiology. And this is a little bit of a misnomer, okay? I want to make sure that we're talking on the same terms here. Hamartiology is the study of sin, but that study should produce an ethic or ethical principles that are opposite to the sin discovered in the study of sin, okay? And so Christian ethics are what really carry the liability, not necessarily the hamartiology. Anybody can study hamartiology and come up with a theology of sin, but it's the ethics, it's the actions on those that could start to develop some liabilities for people and for churches. For example, even in small businesses or in large businesses and other organizations outside of the church, the Hobby Lobby case is a great example. They had a hamartiology, or in their theology of sin, gave them the belief that the morning after pill or emergency contraception acted as abortifacients, and therefore they could not support that, okay? And they very courageously went to the Supreme Court and made that argument and won, okay? But there are other instances in which that's just not going to be the case, that our ethics carry risk. And Jesus said they would. So we shouldn't treat that as a surprise, but we need to make sure that we're properly managing that risk. So is there a danger in publishing your ethics, that which you have derived from your hamartiology? And the answer to that question is yes. It can put a target on you. If you come out as a church and say, ethically, we will not perform nor recognize same-sex marriages, there are some in the equal marriage movement and those who would prefer, equal rights for same-sex couples and for practicing homosexuals. They could come and that could put a target on your church's back. And so you kind of have to pay attention to that, and that could certainly be a downside to that. But I'm going to tell you that there are greater, in my opinion, problems with not publishing your ethics. Certainly, if you publish your ethics, it could lead somebody to join another church. But again, you should be okay with that, because at the end of the day, you don't want somebody joining your church that's going to run counter to what your church is trying to accomplish and what your church believes and what your church practices. And so, but here's the danger: if you don't publish some sort of ethical statement, if you don't have some ethics on key topics, then it could get you in a position where legally you are impotent to confront sin properly. Okay. And here's what I mean. So for example, let's talk about the SOGI laws, sexual orientation, gender identity laws. Those could very well require churches to allow men who identify as women to go into women's bathrooms. Okay. If the church was considered a place of public accommodation, is how those laws are written, then the church could be subject to those laws. And what is a place of public accommodation? Well, it's any place where the public is welcome. The church is welcome, or the public is welcome in most churches. And so you have to draft your foundational documents in such a way that protect the church as a private organization of believers. And that's what the church is. It's a group of people who follow Christ. That's the called out ones, ecclesia in the Greek. And so, you have to be able to protect that. But at the same time, you want people coming to your church who are lost, who need to hear the gospel. And so we've got to make sure, though, that our ethics establish us to a certain degree as a closed organization, not just our beliefs, not just our statement of faith, but how we practice. We need to be practiced as an organization of believers, not as an organization that's just open to the public and is therefore a place of public accommodation. So again, we've got to set the church apart. We've got to make sure that the church is pure. Another example, anti-discrimination laws. These are already being used to a certain degree to force churches to be indiscriminate in hiring on the basis of sexual orientation and some other things as well. And so we've got to be very careful that if our ethics are not out there and they're not biblically based and they're backed up by Scripture and what we believe in our statement of faith, then the courts could come in and say, listen, for certain positions, you're going to have to not consider somebody's sexual orientation or their gender or any other aspect in which Scripture would suggest that we need to be discriminate in how we hire, certainly for the pastor, certainly for other roles. So we've got to be very careful about how we do that. The law's exemption in some cases right now could be read to limit that to credentialed pastoral staff. So for example, the case that I'm specifically thinking of right now is a case out of, I want to say it was out of Wisconsin or Illinois, somewhere in the upper Midwest. And basically what that case said is that because this particular church had credentialed a teacher, that some of these anti-discrimination laws didn't apply to that church. So this was a church that had a school in it, and they gave ministerial credentials to a teacher of that school. And that teacher, she sued the church because of some discrimination issue. She lost that case at the United States Supreme Court because she was credentialed. Now, we might say that that's a victory, but we've got to be very careful in calling that a victory, because at the end of the day, that may have just set precedent for the notion that, and to a degree it did, it set precedent because it's already been relied on in that regard, that it set precedent that says you have to be credentialed in order for a church to be discriminate in how it hires. And so we've got to be very, very careful and make sure our ethics are very clearly based. Otherwise, we may lose a religious liberty argument as an exemption to some of these laws. So anti-solicitation laws. There are some reports cropping up here and there that anti-solicitation laws are being used to stop evangelism and church invitation and church growth, neighborhood canvassing, and things like that. Noise ordinances, of all things, sound pollution laws, are being used to stop some worship services. Again, sexual orientation and gender identity laws, these SOGI ordinances, could be used to require the church to marry, baptize, and even extend the Lord's Supper to practicing homosexuals if the church has never defined themselves not as a place of public accommodation. And this is already being done to public chaplains. We've seen reports of several military branches and police forces that have chaplains, requiring those chaplains to provide basically religious ordinances or sacraments to practicing homosexuals, even though that particular chaplain had a moral, biblical objection and religious objection to that particular practice. And so if we don't have our ethics published and we don't have them well documented biblically, we don't have them set up both foundationally in terms of our articles of incorporation, our bylaws, but also in terms of our statement of faith and our code of ethics. If we don't have those out there, if we don't have them in writing, again, as a litigator, it's going to be hard for me to go to a jury and say, this is what they have always believed. If I can go to them and hand them a statement of faith that says it was adopted by the church on this day, and this is the ethics that they produced from that on this date, I can go to a jury and I can make that argument very clearly. Or I can go to a judge if necessary and make that argument very clearly. But if it's not in writing, if you don't have that in place and you don't clearly tell the public this is what we believe, then it's much harder to claim a religious liberty exemption in the event that we have to go defend the church in court. All right. So if the church can't respond to sin appropriately, the church can't be pure. We've already talked about the purity of the church. We've got to be able to defend the integrity and the purity of Christ's church. All right. Last topic, we're going to move on to risk and missiology. Missiology is the study of missions. And missions is really one of the riskiest things that churches do. We send people on international mission trips. All right, we have got to do it, okay? Jesus sent us out into the world to make disciples. He didn't say go next door, even though we need to go next door. He said go into all the world and make disciples. He said you'll be my witnesses to the end of the earth, and then the end will come. So we have got to go and make disciples of all the nations, which means churches need to be sending people overseas for the sake of spreading the gospel. Now, I'm a firm believer that part of the process of sanctification is learning how to follow Christ and taking the risks that are associated with that. And if somebody says, well, there is no risk in following Christ, read the Bible, because Jesus said, take up your cross daily and follow me. Okay, that's a risky deal. And so following Christ has risks, and people need to be able to pick up those risks and run with them. All right. And there's a way that we can help guide people who are participating in mission trips to take that risk, but also do it in the same vein, protect the church from any liability that comes from sending people on international mission trips. So let's talk through those. What are the risks in going on international mission trips? I have kind of a standard form that I send to churches who are asking for this particular document for any kind of waiver for a mission trip or anything like that. And here's how I spell out the risks. First of all, there's a risk of delay or canceled travel by the participant's own decision or that of an airline or other transportation service provider or foreign government. Okay, if you've ever been on a mission trip overseas, you know travel is always a headache most of the time. Secondly, injuries typically sustained by any transportation failure, such as a car, bus, train, or airplane crash. You never know, okay? So you've got to set that risk out there. Theft, seizure, forfeiture, or loss of any personal belongings happens all the time, okay? That's always a risk when you go on mission trips, that your stuff could get stolen or seized by a government. Fourth, you could be imprisoned, kidnapped, deported, or other governmental or non-governmental use of force against that person who's participating in a mission trip. So that's a risk. They need to know about that risk before they go overseas. They can acquire, this is the fifth risk, the acquiring of the diseases and illnesses listed on the United States Department of State and Centers for Disease Control websites. And so for every country out there, for every location, there's going to be a list of food and airborne illnesses and things that people could pick up, that if they go overseas, they might get sick. And so they need to know what those things are before they go on the trip. Food and waterborne illnesses that may cause nausea, diarrhea, vomiting, dehydration, fever, and other gastrointestinal maladies. They need to know that you may not like the food. Your stomach may not be able to handle the food that's going over there. First time I went to India, man, that food was spicy. And I'd had Indian food here before, and my stomach had a hard time dealing with the spice. I hear a lot of people doing the same thing, but we need to talk about those things ahead of time. Insect and animal bites, which may cause a variety of serious medical conditions. You can get dengue fever, you can get malaria, all sorts of stuff could happen. You can be seriously obtain a serious physical injury. You can get exacerbated medical conditions due to a lack of access to health care if you're going to a place where there's not a hospital nearby. You know, your injury or whatever medical condition you might get worse because you can't get to a hospital quick enough. There are other unforeseen possibilities of financial loss and physical harm associated with a mission trip. You're never going to be able to spell them all out. And of course, let's be, as a lawyer, I'm going to always throw this in there. Look, there's a possibility that you could die. Okay. People give their lives up for Christ every day. And certainly on the mission field is where it typically happens. And so you could certainly lose your life. And these are risks that you need to set out in any kind of a waiver. You need to tell people these are the risks. And as a pastor, you can shepherd them towards those risks and shepherd them to accept those risks and say, you know what? Following Christ requires these risks, and it's right for me to accept them. In fact, there's a book by John Piper called Risk is Right. I'd highly recommend it. Go read it. It's a great book. It's actually a series of just a few chapters that comes from a larger work, but Risk is Right, great book to read. So if you send a volunteer or staff member on a mission trip, by default, your church is probably liable for any of those things that happen. Any of those risks belong to the church. All right. Now, you can assign that risk, or the people participating in the trip can assume that risk, and they should assume that risk. In my pastoral opinion. And so what should be our missiology in regard to risk? Again, our missiology should say risk is right, that it is right to accept risk. It's right to go and take risky actions for the cause of Christ. And so in this document that I've talked about, I spell out these risks and why I believe despite these risks that things should happen. So first of all, I believe that despite these risks that the gospel of Christ must be carried around the world. And again, good practice here is to have biblical justification for every statement that you make in any contract, any document, any articles of incorporation, bylaws, anything like that. Have biblical backing for what you're saying. So you're asking people to sign a document here that says, I believe that despite these risks, the gospel of Christ must be carried around the world. And so you cite Matthew 24:14. You cite Mark 13:10. You cite Matthew 28:18 through 20. It says in here that I'm called to take the gospel around the world. Again, the Great Commission, Acts 1:8. It's costly to follow Christ. Luke 14 talks about all of that. But despite all that, neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor rulers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor powers, nor height, nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate these participants from the love of Christ. Again, that's a direct quote out of Romans 8. And so you put that in there. You put the quote in there that says, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And certainly we know Christ goes with us on these mission trips. So have that statement out of Philippians 4. God is for us and none can be against us. That's, again, right out of Romans chapter 8. Any trial that these participants face, they're saying, if I face a trial, it will result in my steadfastness and sanctification. It's a quote out of James 1. It's also in Romans 5. So taking risks for the cause of Christ is the right thing to do. And they make a statement to that effect. They say this: Christ is so valuable that the hope of his immediate and eternal fellowship frees me from the self-serving fear of these risks and enables me to take these risks for the eternal good of others. With no special revelation from God regarding the outcome of this trip, I take those risks, trusting in the all-providing, all-ruling, all-satisfying Son of God, Jesus Christ. All right, now that's a powerful statement. And if they read that and they internalize it, then we have taken, as pastors, great strides in helping them in this process of sanctification and helping ourselves even in the process of sanctification. Because look, as I go on mission trips or as I engage in risky behavior, I want to make sure that I internalize what I'm doing. And so I have to put myself in the path of sanctification all the time. And this is a way to do that when I, as a pastor and as a lawyer, go on a mission trip. All right, so you do all that, and then how can we protect the church and shepherd participants into a deeper love of Christ? You have them sign that document. You have a waiver that spells all of this out. And you tell them what the activities are that you're doing on the trip. You have to tell them what the risks of those activities are. You have to ask them why they are assuming that risk. And I've just read all those reasons why and back them up with Scripture. You have to have all the standard legal mumbo jumbo, and I can provide that to you. Heirs, assigns, forever we indemnify, all the legal jargon. Okay, that's got to be in there. It needs to be signed either electronically or on paper, preferably on paper, but it at least needs to have some sort of an electronic signature. It should be signed by both parents on behalf of a minor child who's going on one of these trips, and that's the case in any waiver. It needs to be signed by both parents if the parents are being asked to assume responsibility for the risks on behalf of a child. And then, just as a quick side note, any minors who are going overseas without their parents, they will also need to carry a special consent form that meets Department of State and U.S. Customs and Immigration Enforcement regulations. And certainly we can provide you with that at Church General Counsel as well. All right, so that concludes my presentation on the subject. We're about 38 minutes in. And so if anybody has a question, there's still not very many people in that are watching the interactive portion of this. So I'm going to guess that there won't be any questions, but Rick, if you've got one, certainly feel free to ask it. If not, guys, I apologize again for the phone ringing, and we're still trying to work out some of the details of these webinars. That will certainly remind me next time to not have the phone on, make sure the phone is turned off before I do one of these webinars. But guys, thanks so much for watching. If you're watching on Facebook or if you're watching on YouTube or some other means a little bit later, thank you so much for watching this. If there's anything that we can do at Church General Counsel to help you in this process, please let me know. Go to churchgeneralcounsel.com. You can see how we price things out and all that good stuff. But we'd love to help you. We are here as a ministry to churches. We are a parachurch organization. We are here to come alongside the local church. And we try to do that in the truest sense. We know that the church is the greatest organization in the world, that Jesus will come back for the church. He's not coming back for me personally. He's not coming back for Church General Counsel. He's coming back for the church. And so we want to do everything we can to help the local church. So if we can help you in any way, please reach out to us, churchgeneralcounsel.com. All right. Thanks so much again for watching. You guys have a wonderful rest of the day. And if there's anything we can do to help you, please let us know. Take care.